Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps only in movies can women be assassins or hired soldiers. In real life, 8 out of 10 criminals are men, according to statistics. If women do commit violent acts, they usually do so as accomplices or instigators. Alongside the elderly, disabled, and minors, women often appear as victims. They differ from men not only physiologically, but also psychologically. The behavior of the male half of humanity is aggressive and provocative, unlike that of women. Women are more gentle, emotional. They enter a state of hypnosis more easily, are more quickly and strongly affected by anesthetics and psychoactive substances, are more prone to depression, and are more susceptible to deceit and manipulation. A woman is always guided by love, compassion, creation. However, their aspirations are not always shared by the partners they choose for life. This leads to a confrontation of two principles, often destructive for the weaker party in the relationship. Whenever something extraordinary happens, such as a disappearance or a crime against life, the entire city or even the country empathetically follows the developments, especially if the crime is publicized and the potential criminal shows no remorse for their actions. This is a story about another mysterious crime against a young woman that shook Orange Beach, Alabama, USA, on the calendar May 19, 2016. The police chief informed Gary Bardwell, the father of the missing Jessie, of the long-awaited news. "I'm sorry, sir," he began. "Today will be a difficult day for your family. Unfortunately, we do not expect to find your daughter alive, but we know where she might be." A team of detectives along with FBI agents set out for a remote ranch in Farmersville, North Texas. The group arrived in the evening and immediately went searching. In the wooded area, law enforcement officers stumbled upon a piece of metal covering something. There was an unbearable smell of decay nearby. However, those who arrived were prepared not only for this, but also for what caused it. Indeed, on the other side of the shield lay a female body, wrapped in a blue sheet. The corpse was covered with a blanket and 2 red-gold towels with bloodstains. A pile of trash mixed with dirt became the improvised gravestone for the unfortunate. It was clear that the perpetrator was an amateur, as trying to hide the result of their actions, they made it more noticeable. The condition of the body was terrible. After a week under the scorching sun, it had significantly decomposed. Experts needed 7 days to officially identify the victim. For this, dental records of the presumed victim were requested. As the investigation suspected, the discovered body belonged to 27-year-old Jessie Bardwell. The examination showed that the young woman's death was the result of a crime. However, the exact cause could not be determined as the body was too decomposed. Notably, an unknown informant pointed to the location of the woman's remains. Their name was not disclosed until the end. Jessie Bardwell, a beloved daughter and friend, seemingly vanished from the home she shared with her boyfriend named Jason Lowe. Sensing trouble, Gary set off from Mississippi to Texas in search of his child. His instincts were correct. His girl had indeed been in danger for quite some time. But let's start from the beginning. It must be said that the father-daughter relationship was exceptionally strong. Gary recalled being deeply moved at the moment of Jessie's birth. She was so fragile and vulnerable that his heart melted and never belonged to him again. Jessie was born on September 10, 1988, in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Gary and Carla Bardwell were wonderful parents, and besides their daughter, they raised a son named Brandon. The siblings got along well, with the older brother always protecting his little sister from bullies. Grandma Kitty, who adored her grandchildren, was a frequent visitor. She read books to them, shared life stories, and invented various games. In short, they were the quintessential American family. Jessie herself was a joyful, cheerful, and kind girl. She had a unique style that set her apart from her friends. She dreamed of making it in the beauty industry and opening her own salon. When Jessie was 14, the family unit broke down. The Bardwells divorced. When it came time to choose whom to live with, the girl chose her father. Their relationship was warm and trusting. Gary worked as a firefighter, so Jessie often called him to check on him and ensure everything was fine. Over time, the man remarried. However, the stepdaughter and stepmother got along well. Gina was an excellent homemaker and took care of everyone in the household. Jessie understood that her father was happy and not alone with such a woman by his side, which was very important to her since she would eventually leave the nest. After finishing school, Jessie decided to become independent, so she moved to Orange Beach, Alabama. To support herself, she worked as a waitress at the popular beachfront restaurant Cobalt. Gary remembered how she loved being near the water. It calmed her. Father and daughter kept in constant touch, exchanging messages. When he visited, they would go boating and fishing. Kimberly Esbury, the restaurant manager and Jessie's friend, learned that Jessie's father was a talented musician. Upon retiring, he devoted more time to his passion, honing his skills. As a result, he was often invited to perform at the establishment and even had his own table there. Kimberly later admitted to admiring the relationship between Jessie and her father. They were true friends. Jessie was always present at his performances. The tips she earned went towards college and her dream. At work, she met a young man named Terry Ellis, also a waiter. They started dating after some time. Their relationship was steady and serious. They seemed like a harmonious couple. However, at one of the social events, Jessie was taken by his friend Jason Lowe. Her sudden infatuation surprised everyone. It seemed she was head over heels in love with him, oblivious to everything else around her. After explaining her sudden feelings, Jessie and Terry parted as amicably as they had met. Nonetheless, this decision turned her life upside down by 360 degrees. The new boyfriend was undoubtedly handsome and promising. He had 2 degrees and a decent job. Jason knew how to present himself and was polite. However, for Jessie, the new feelings were also a ticket to a new life. When he heard about his beloved's dreams, he promised to fulfill them. Eventually, the young man needed to transfer to Dallas, Texas. Then, Jessie followed him. The new position in the technology industry promised Jason a high-paying job. Kimberly shared that Jessie saw the move more as an adventure than something that could fundamentally change her life. She certainly didn't want to part with her father for long and hesitated for a while. However, ambition and youthful idealism prevailed. She did all this in secret from Gary. She was very afraid of disappointing her father, knowing he would be against it. Therefore, she didn't tell him even when they spent their last Christmas together. Mr. Bardwell noticed nothing unusual in his daughter's behavior. She was as happy as usual, laughing and joking. So, the 24-year-old found herself in Richardson, a suburb of Dallas. Jason worked from home, while Jessie searched for a new job and scouted locations for her salon. The couple planned to marry and buy a house. However, Jessie's relationship with her father underwent a drastic change. They grew distant. The daughter stopped answering his calls. Mr. Bardwell was troubled by this uncharacteristic behavior. After speaking with Kimberly, he learned about Jessie's new boyfriend and her move to another state. Ultimately, the man accepted the news and tried to re-establish contact. That's when he discovered that Jason controlled all communications. The only way to speak with Jessie was to call her boyfriend or the home phone. After each attempt, Jason would say she'd call back. Eventually, Jessie did indeed get in touch with her father. Months later, Gary finally met the suspicious young man in person when the couple visited Pascagoula. The father tried to convince his daughter not to return to Texas. He had a strong dislike for Lowe. That time, Jessie hugged him tighter than usual. When Gary asked if everything was okay, she said it was fine. She expressed her desire to make them proud, hence her need to leave. Persuading Jessie otherwise was impossible. Despite never showing signs of distress, her father had a bad feeling. After meeting with her, he wrote a song titled "Taken," dedicated to his daughter. 4 months after moving to Texas, she stopped responding to calls altogether. The final straw came on May 8th, when she failed to wish her mother and stepmother a happy Mother's Day, uncharacteristic of her. Gary sensed something terrible had happened, especially since she missed such a cherished family holiday. He called Jason, who claimed he didn't know Jessie's whereabouts. The boyfriend mentioned they were in an open relationship, allowing her to come and go as she pleased. Gary knew this to be false. Jason contradicted himself. He was very jealous and controlled every move. The next morning, the father headed to Texas, convinced of the boyfriend's involvement in his daughter's disappearance. En route, he messaged Lowe, "If Jessie isn't home when I arrive, you're in big trouble." Upon reaching their apartment, he found no trace of his daughter or her belongings. Yet, the boyfriend persisted he was unaware of her location and awaited her return. Later, Kimberly shared details Jessie confided during their rare heart-to-heart conversations. Apparently, Jason squandered money on prohibited substances and entertainment. His promises to fulfill the girl's dream evaporated. Largely, the boyfriend pretended to be someone he wasn't. This extended to his treatment of Jessie. Publicly, their relationship appeared one way, but in private, Jason could be rude and aggressive, leading to frequent conflicts between them. With Jessie missing from the house, Gary filed a missing person report with the Richardson police. Detective Hiram Hale, a father of 3 daughters, led the investigation into her disappearance. The man was determined to uncover the truth. Law enforcement officials acted immediately. They spoke with Lowe several times and inspected the house, but found no trace of the missing woman. During the conversation, the young man mentioned that he last saw her on May 8th around 10 a.m., leaving without explanation, possibly to visit her parents. He saw her get into her Acura car and drive away. Jason kept insisting that despite strong feelings, their relationship was non-committal. He claimed he didn't control her or pry into her personal life. However, investigators received information contradicting his statements. It turned out Jessie had sold her car 3 weeks earlier, a fact he surely knew since he was present at the sale. This raised questions for the investigators, prompting them to interrogate him again. On May 12th, during a subsequent search of his home, police found a strip of powder on a plate in the kitchen. The substance turned out to be cocaine. The investigation then focused on Lowe's garage and the vehicle inside it. Initially resistant, citing the garage was shared and needed others' permission for a search, Lowe eventually ceased his objections. Upon entering, officers immediately noticed a smell characteristic of crime. Jason Lowe's Audi was mud-splattered, and its bumper was detached. Police suspected that Jessie Bardwell might be inside the car. Although the vehicle was empty, the smell of decomposition intensified. Inside, they found the broken bumper and what appeared to be bloodstains in the trunk. When experts sprayed a luminol-based substance, the cargo area lit up with blue light. Blood, presumably belonging to the missing woman. Jason explained he got stuck in the mud while searching for his girlfriend, catching the bumper on a bush. He remained adamant about not knowing her whereabouts. He could not explain the blood in the car or the presence of controlled substances in his home. Experts concluded the amount of blood in the trunk indicated the woman was deceased. Given the circumstances, the case was reclassified as a homicide. To prevent the main suspect from fleeing, he was detained on charges related to the narcotic substances. During interrogation, Lowe persisted in his narrative. When shown a photo of his loved one, he refused to provide explanations, looking emotionlessly at the picture and suggesting he was being framed for something he didn't do. Eventually, despite the absence of a body, the suspect was charged with homicide. As the search for the young woman continued, a challenging and lengthy process in the vastness of Texas, with its many rivers, lakes, fields, and forests, where a body could easily be concealed, her family, friends, and sympathetic acquaintances held a memorial service. The event took place on the beach by the water Jessie loved. Everyone prayed for her to be found and for justice for her suffering. Their prayers were answered on May 19th when Jessica Bardwell was found deceased. Her loved ones at least had the chance to mourn her and say goodbye. Gary felt it necessary to review his daughter's autopsy report. He was appalled that his girl, wrapped in a sheet and barely recognizable as a human, was discarded like trash. Her body was returned to her hometown thanks to Gary's friends. former colleagues hired and loaded Jessie into a funeral hearse. About 1,000 people visited the First United Methodist Church to pay their respects to the victim. Kitty Bardwell, Jessie's grandmother, confessed, "If this town could be cleansed with the tears shed for Jessie, it would truly be clean." The tragedy that struck their family garnered widespread attention, with many expressing sincere condolences for their premature loss, coming forward to support the Bardwells. A year had passed. Gary sat in McKinney Jail in Texas, still reluctantly cooperating with the investigation. However, 2 facts regarding Jessie's case were eventually extracted from him. Firstly, he claimed what happened to her was an accident, planning to reveal the details in court, hoping for the jury's understanding. This made it challenging for the prosecution to build their case during the trial, much to the delight of Andy Farkas, Lowe's attorney. Farkas staged a mock trial with outsiders acting as jurors. Based on the available evidence and Jason's confession, the mock trial regarding Jessica's case fell apart. 15 pseudo-jurors decided to acquit Lowe. Farkas hoped that knowing the truth, a real court would also deliver a not guilty verdict. Remember the anonymous tip about the victim's body location? It turned out that information came from Jason himself. This became another piece of evidence obtained during the investigation. The prosecution offered a deal to reduce his sentence by half if he disclosed Jessie's location. After deliberation and consultation with his lawyer, he agreed, requesting that the source of the information remain confidential until the trial. The deal was motivated by law enforcement's desire to allow Jessie's family to say goodbye and bury her body humanely. As time went on, the grief-stricken father longed for justice. To quell his raging fury, he once decided to take a unique approach. Gary printed a photo of Jason, placed it on a stump, and pounded it with a 12-pound sledgehammer. This form of psychological therapy offered him some, albeit small, relief. Mr. Bardwell confessed to struggling to get out of bed in the mornings, living with the hope that Lowe would soon face trial and be convicted for the murder of his only daughter. He blamed himself for what happened, regretting not convincing his daughter to stay or at least break up with her controlling boyfriend. Jessie once called her father, admitting he was right after arguing with Jason, who had kicked her out. She was sheltered by a new friend, but returned to her boyfriend the next day, giving him another chance. Gary had no choice but to accept his daughter's decision, a choice he would deeply regret later. When the trial finally began, Mr. Bardwell arrived in Texas, determined to achieve just punishment. Prosecutor Cynthia Walker began her opening statement by characterizing Jason. Most viewed him as a complex personality with few friends, mostly avoided due to his long history with controlled substances, often leading to uncontrollable rage. Perhaps Jessie was caught in one of these moments. Prosecutor Wes Wynn called Lowe's former girlfriends as witnesses. They confirmed the prosecution's claims about his aggression, sharing fears for their lives due to his jealousy-driven violence. Like with Jessie, he isolated them from family and friends, displaying clear manipulative and pathological lying traits. Hence, each ended their relationship, which was no easy feat, requiring caution and cunning. Conversely, Lowe showcased his superiority among men, effectively pulling the wool over people's eyes. Jason quickly responded to these court revelations. He disclosed starting substance use at 13, influenced by friends, leading to addiction. Nevertheless, he strived to not lose his way in life, achieving multiple degrees and working for a renowned global company. Lowe confessed his desire to fulfill Jessie's dream out of love, aiming to build a family with her. In contrast, the prosecution painted a picture of a man far from someone who had recently lost his beloved, and here's why. The investigation determined that the young woman's demise occurred between May 1st and May 3rd, presumably on the day when the Jordans, the couple's neighbors, last saw her alive. Following an argument that led to Jessie's demise, Jason moved her body to the garage and placed it in the trunk of his car, where it remained for several days. The blood traces found in the Audi indeed belonged to Jessie. He later transported her body to a remote farm and concealed it in the nearby woods. It was established that the sheet wrapping the body was part of Lowe's bedding set, which was still found in his home. Fearlessly using it even after Jessie's death, while her body was decomposing in the car, the accused continued to see other women. His phone was filled with corroborative messages and intimate photos, which he sent to these women before meeting them at his apartment. Jason explained that he was trying to distract himself and forget, often indulging in substance use, claiming it made dealing with reality easier. The investigation learned of Jason's presence at Jessie's time of death through a clever manipulation. As the suspect had long denied involvement, detectives asked Tommy Jordan, an acquaintance, to speak with Jason. During their monitored conversation, Lowe admitted he messed up and made a mistake, confessing to an unfortunate accident with Jessie and his guilt, albeit for criminal negligence. Law enforcement took this as a confession. Realizing the investigation was on to him, Jason struck a deal with the prosecution and disclosed the body's location. At the trial, he finally shared his version of events. That evening, he and Jessie took pills that enhanced libido and then became intimate in the shower. At one point, Jason slipped, followed by Jessie, who hit her head on the porcelain bathtub. She then sat down, complaining of feeling hot and dizzy. Jason claimed he offered to call an ambulance, but Jessie refused, suggesting rest and sleep would suffice. However, he found her unconscious the next morning, lying on his chest without breathing. Despite his attempts to revive her, Jessie was dead. Fearing being accused of homicide, he hesitated to call the police and decided to act on his own, initially leaving the body in his car. Days later, he resolved to hide the body on a remote farm, where he carelessly disposed of his former lover in a pile of trash without a proper burial. His story might have been believable if not for the defendant's character and the forensic medical examination findings. The woman had suffered cranial injuries, which couldn't have resulted from slaps to the face, indicating Jason attempted to conceal evidence of a beating. Thus, his entire narrative was fabricated. After a 6-hour deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Judge Scott Becker sentenced the criminal to 50 years in prison. The term could have been longer, up to 99 years, but was reduced due to Jason's deal with the prosecution as agreed. Lowe won't be eligible for parole until at least 2041. At the verdict announcement, Gary was relieved justice prevailed, yet he saw no remorse in the young man's eyes. Standing with the victim's father were Jason's ex-girlfriends. One, Chrissy Chambers, remarked that if she could say anything to Jessie, it would be, "Run, just save yourself." To this day, the convicted Lowe denies his guilt in the homicide, insisting it was an accident. The love of his life decayed in his car while he continued to live and entertain himself. Tragically, Jessie Bardwell saw the dark side of Jason Lowe too late. Daddy's girl hadn't realized how deceitful and brutal men could be, having always had a model of male integrity and care in her father Gary. Regrettably, scoundrels possess a peculiar charm, easily lying or embellishing to intrigue or enamor. This story is a cautionary tale that a woman must choose herself, her safety, and her freedom always and regardless. Otherwise, the story's end can be tragic not just for her but for her entire family. There are crimes that at first glance are difficult to assess unambiguously. On the one hand, the law of any state guarantees the inviolability of life and health of every person. In contrast, it is often opposed by the testimony of witnesses who minimize the guilt of the attacker. One such controversial case was the crime that occurred in the Mullenix family. Let's try to make sense of it together. Let's find out the reasons for the tension and weigh the responsibility of each person involved. Could it be that the victim is far from innocent? Or is her executioner a wolf in sheep's clothing? An unexpected discovery. On September 14, 2006, Newport Beach was troubled. A woman's body was discovered in a body of water. Apparently, the corpse had been wrapped in a sheet and then placed in a box. When exposed to the water, the unreliable wrapping fell apart and exposed what should have been hidden from view. The body floated to the surface after being in the water for no more than a day. Normally, warm water would speed up the decomposition process. Therefore, the appearance of the dead left much to be desired. Forensic medical examination established the cause of the woman's death was multiple stab wounds. In total, she received about 52 blows, one of which came directly to the eye. Specialists agreed that the injuries were caused by 3 different knives, which means there were at least 2 people who attacked the victim. Naturally, the victim had no identification on her, so the police had to work hard to find out her identity. Among the missing, the profile of the woman was not listed, and no new disappearances have been reported so far. Everything pointed to attempts to cover up the crime committed. Experts also determined that the woman had resorted to plastic surgery during her lifetime. She had breast augmentation. Since the identification of bodies by serial number of implants became a routine procedure, the identity of the murdered was soon established. She was 56-year-old Barbara Mullenix. Who is Barbara Mullenix? The future Mrs. Mullenix was born on May 29, 1950 in Munich, Germany. In her youth, she was very beautiful and sociable. Therefore, she was always in the center of attention. However, these qualities brought her not only success with the opposite sex, but also caused her a lot of trouble. At the age of 18, she was subjected to violence. The girl wanted to forget as quickly as possible what happened, but after a while she learned about the pregnancy. To make an abortion Barbara did not become, she decided to bear the child and give it to a good family. After a while, she got married. In the marriage, she gave birth to a son, Alex Hagwood. However, the marital relationship with her first husband did not last long. At the age of 35, Barbara's attention was attracted by Bruce Mullenix. The man recalled that she was a special woman and immediately liked him. She was characterized by straightforwardness and self-confidence. In November 1987, the couple married. Mr. Mullenix was younger than his wife for 9 years, but it was not particularly felt. Barbara knew how to arouse interest and liked to have fun. After moving to Oklahoma City, a daughter, Rachel, was born to the family. Everything was fine at first, but as time went on, problems began. In the evenings, Bruce could skip on a mug of beer, and on weekends to drop in on friends. Barbara at first supported the company, but later became addicted to alcohol. Apparently, the events that occurred in her youth left their imprint. Under the influence of alcohol, the woman, despite the parents' relationship with each other, they loved their daughter very much. They spoiled her and tried to please her in every way. While living in Oklahoma, before the divorce, Rachel had a large room while her father and mother lived in a small one. On the occasion of the girls' birthday parties were always held in the house. Miss Mullenix recalled that she was very close to her mother, even more so than most mothers and daughters. But such a close bond existed only when the woman was sober. The rest of the time, Rachel tried to stay away from her, made no attempt to even talk to her. Our relationship was generally good, but when Barbara drank, she got angry and crazy. She was the first one to get into a fight. Bruce confirmed what his daughter said. Since the house Mullenixoff was located near Hollywood, Barbara was in an extraordinary delight. She loved movies, especially singled out Gone with the Wind. A short time after the move, the woman managed to get a job as an extra. Hollywood dream come true. She felt that in time she would be offered a more serious role. But for now, together with her daughter, took an active part in the masses in movies and TV shows. The scene of the crime was established. Who is the culprit? Police officers could not understand why none of the relatives did not report the disappearance of the murdered woman. Soon, police officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright obtained a search warrant for Barbara's home. They hypothesized that since the woman was wrapped in a sheet, the crime could have occurred in bed. So the search for evidence had to begin at Mrs. Mullenix's residence. The police found no one at Barbara's house. At first glance, everything seemed to be in order. There were no visible signs of a crime. However, in one of the rooms on the second floor, a disassembled bed attracted attention. It was without a mattress. It only took a couple hours to reconstruct the scene. The detectives' assumptions had a real basis. Specialists found traces of blood on the walls. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to get rid of the evidence. The blood-stained mattress had apparently been destroyed. There was no doubt that the crime had taken place in this place. The police also believed that the owner of the house knew the perpetrator. Therefore, the first suspect was Mr. Mullenix. It was a strange coincidence that the man was out of town. In addition, just the day after the body was discovered, Bruce returned home. He explained that he was worried because his wife and daughter were not answering their phone calls. The man, of course, had a premonition of something wrong, but in no way expected to hear such a thing. Nevertheless, the news of Barbara's terrible death, the former spouse took it calmly. This also alerted the detectives, so they began to investigate the reason for his departure. Bruce said he was on a business trip. Mr. Mullenix's management confirmed his alibi. The investigation was back to square one: daughter's love. When Rachel turned 17 years old, she met with Ian Allen. The guy was older than the girl by 4 years. Young people fell madly in love with each other. Ian supported Rachel in everything, even helped with household chores. At first, Barbara liked him. They even spent time together. They went for walks together. They went out together. In order for the lovers to meet freely, Rachel's parents got a special permit. Apparently, so required by law and police officers. Law enforcers often drew attention to the non-standard couple. The girl was allowed to be absent until 1 o'clock in the morning, but she often violated the established schedule, for which she was repeatedly under house arrest. After a while, Mrs. Mullenix noticed that her daughter's feelings were growing into something more. To make matters worse, the two announced that they had decided to get engaged. The move seemed too quick to Barbara. Ian and Rachel had only known each other for 3 months. Barbara didn't want to lose her daughter and the payments she received from her ex-husband. Barbara decided to increase her influence and discipline. Rachel was caught between two fires. She didn't want to offend her mother, whose control was only increasing. Ian, in turn, did not give way. So her mother and Ian began to compete for Rachel's attention. Rachel's fragile psyche suffered with every quarrel and altercation that arose between them. By the end of the summer of 2006, Ian and Barbara's relationship finally deteriorated. The younger Alan was afraid that Rachel's mother would convince her not to date him or forbid her from doing so at all. One day, when Rachel once again violated her schedule for coming home, Barbara exploded. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Mullenix headed to the boyfriend's house and made a scandal. This situation really offended and angered Ian. It became clear to everyone that it couldn't go on like this. On the trail of the fugitives, Bruce was no longer suspected of killing his ex-wife. Detectives turned their attention to Rachel and Ian. Police found out that Barbara had been feeling lonely lately and was drinking a lot. It made her inadequate. Her daughter's attention was slipping away from her. She considered Ian an unworthy companion and Rachel a traitor. That's why Mrs. Mullenix often quarreled with them. Besides, no one knew where the lovers were. They never contacted each other. Given the complicated relationship between Barbara and Ian, the girl's father assumed that Ian was a criminal who was being sought. Rachel, in all likelihood, is not safe either. Otherwise, she would have made herself known, Mr. Mullenix pondered. The police began searching for the missing persons. The Allens' house was also searched. When the detectives checked Ian's computer, they found curious queries on the internet. The guy was researching the route of transportation to the city of Tampa, which is located in Florida. Bruce remembered that before moving in with him, Barbara and Rachel lived there. The couple was reported missing. All police stations in the country received bulletins with a description of the appearance of young people. In addition, the alleged suspect did not disappear without a trace. He left a decent trail behind him. Ian Allen's credit card was used to make a purchase at a gas station in Louisiana. That's also where a surveillance camera captured the guy's truck. Mr. Mullenix's fears were confirmed. Rachel was indeed with him. The only thing left to do was to intercept them. So officers Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright called their colleagues from the next town on the couple's route. Local police shut down highways in search of the van. Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix were soon caught. The kidnapping story. "Do you know I've been kidnapped?" Rachel shouted when apprehended. "What right did you have to arrest me, to throw me on the ground in handcuffs?" She continued, "I'm not a criminal for you to treat me like this." Detectives Joe and Steve waited for the moment when they could finally question the couple. 2 days later, they arrived at a Louisiana police station. Miss Mullenix insisted that she had not killed her mother. Once investigators pressed the girl, she blamed it on her boyfriend. Rachel claimed that Ian killed her mom and afterwards forced her to run away with him. The police asked for more details about what happened on September 13th, 2006. "I woke up to hear noises in the house. Then I realized that my mother was screaming a lot and calling for help. I rushed to her room. What I saw shocked me. Ian had attacked my mom with a knife. He was stabbing her over and over again. I jumped on him, tried to push him away. He was very strong, so he easily fought me back. I couldn't believe what was happening. I was in a kind of stupor." Rachel began her story. Afterwards, she added that the boyfriend forced her to help cover her tracks. He also insisted that she pack her mother's belongings into bags. Rachel claimed that by doing so, Ian wanted to stage Barbara's unexpected departure. At first, the detectives wanted to believe the girl. The shock she'd been through could send anyone into a state of frustration. But for some reason, the witness to the crime was overly justified. And afterwards, she fiercely insisted that she was not involved in the crime. Furthermore, there were no signs of resistance on Rachel's body. When communicating with Ian Allen, police officers found out an interesting fact. His girlfriend from time to time told about how hard it is for her to live with her mother, how intemperate the woman behaves when she drinks. Instead of reconciling the rivals, Rachel only increased Ian's negative feelings. Certainly some of the facts were true, but some of them were clearly exaggerated. That was why Ian was finally convinced that Barbara would not let them rest. Sometime after the night's quarrel at the Allen house, holding a grudge against Barbara, the lad headed for the Mullenix house. Rachel was under house arrest. I wanted to see her. I knew Barbara wouldn't let me in to see her, so I came secretly. I wanted to sneak into her room quietly, but Barbara spotted me. We got into an argument that escalated into threats. With the folding knife I always carry, I decided to scare her. As soon as the blade was at Mrs. Mullenix's throat, she started screaming. This made me angry and provoked an attack. Things got out of control. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Rachel really had nothing to do with it, Ian said about the incident. To the surprise of the investigators, the guy did not try to avoid responsibility and confess to everything. Over time, detectives became increasingly convinced that Rachel Mullenix was directly involved in the crime. Her boyfriend was clearly covering for her. CCTV footage from the gas station convenience store where the couple had stopped was scrutinized. Rachel was walking around the store looking for groceries. At that point, she could have safely called for help or run away. But for some reason, she didn't. Moreover, as it turned out later, the girl had the opportunity to call her father, but preferred to make a call to her friend. It was found that a couple of hours after the crime, Miss Mullenix sent a message to Ian Allen. "I love you," she wrote in her text. And that's how Rachel finally lost the trust of the investigation. Rachel's defense. It took 2 years to gather and analyze all the evidence in the Barbara Mullenix murder case. During that time, Rachel turned 19 years old. For any other girl, that's a great age. There is a whole life ahead of her. For young Mullenix, her future depended on the jury's verdict, and she tried to convince everyone of her innocence. When Rachel talked about her childhood, her face lit up. It was obvious that the tender years were happily spent. No doubt Barbara and Bruce had tried to make them so, despite many circumstances. Recalling the relationship with her mother, the daughter said that they were good. They were marred only by alcohol, which was abused by the murdered woman and the boyfriend who appeared over time. At school, I was known as a girl from a not very prosperous family with alcoholic parents. When my father drank, he was still himself. He was kind and considerate, which can't be said for my mom. She described the family atmosphere in court. Her words were confirmed by her friend Kelsey Douglas, who often visited the Mullenix family. Kelsey said that Rachel always tried to please her mother in everything. But apparently, there came a point when she could no longer tolerate the harsh control and insults. She admitted to me that she had started drinking from time to time. Rachel didn't know what else to do. She had nowhere else to turn. The alcohol helped relieve tension, to forget for a while about family difficulties, Miss Douglas reported. Alex, Rachel's older brother, strangely enough, also stood up for Rachel. He considered her a victim rather than a murderer. That's why he refused to believe in her guilt to the last. He told the court that his sister had been a good and obedient child. She did well at school, practiced sports and ballet. As for the relationship between Barbara, Rachel, and Ian, Alex noted that at first they were great. All three spent a lot of time together. Barbara's eldest son also reported that their mother abused alcohol and illegal substances before her death. She took stimulants and tranquilizers and often threw loud parties. When Barbara realized that Rachel and her boyfriend wanted to distance themselves, she couldn't accept it. In addition, she found it difficult to get by on her own without alimony and maintenance money. All of this became a source of irritation. According to Alex, Mrs. Mullenix was a very controlling woman. She wanted to be in control of everything. With Rachel, she certainly went overboard in this. My mother loved to be the center of attention. With Ian coming into Rachel's life, her position shifted to the side, Alex summarized. In the involvement of his daughter in the murder of Barbara could not believe and the girl's father. He believed that she loved her mother very much and was incapable of hurting her. In all the time, Rachel did not accuse her mother of the weaknesses that were peculiar to her. She simply reported them as a fact. The girl repeatedly stated that she felt sorry for her. Barbara had a difficult life. About the relationship of her parents, Miss Mullenix recalled with bitterness. Rachel said that the slightest details in the behavior of his father drove his mother into a rage. Barbara often snapped at him, considered a spender. Rachel also told the court that she regretted her love for the young man. She made a big mistake when she started dating him. Their feelings brought discord to her relationship with her mother. Ian felt that my mom was a threat to him. He also wanted to control me like she did. My boyfriend wasn't ideal either. Often hurt and treated me like I was his property. I was torn between the two. Every time there was an argument with my mom, I shared about it. It made it easier for me to get over what happened, Rachel recalled. She concluded by adding that Ian did everything he could to prevent harm to what he thought was his prosecution's position. Sonia Belest, the prosecutor involved in the case, did not believe Rachel's story. She claimed that the girl's angelic appearance was deceptive because she thought she was already smart enough for her age. Therefore, the position Miss Mullenix had chosen was thoroughly refuted. The officers who investigated supported the prosecutor in this. Steve Mack and Joe Cartwright believed that Rachel had some mental health issues. According to them, she was the meanest girl they had ever spoken to. During the interview, the prosecutor competently appealed the inconsistencies in Miss Mullenix's testimony. She inquired of Rachel why she never once called for help when she could have done so, to which the girl replied that she was confused and did not know how to behave in such a situation. The defendant also added that she was frightened by Ian's behavior, which was difficult to predict. The prosecutor drew attention to the fact that Rachel had not a single chance to escape. The girl's actions were atypical for a kidnapped victim. The prosecution believed that Miss Mullenix had not only attacked her mother herself, but had planned the crime in advance. When they tried to ask Rachel about the details of Ian's stabbing, Rachel was unable to answer. Her testimony changed and contradicted each other more than once. During the trial, the defendant stated that she was not present during the argument between Barbara and Ian. Allegedly, she simply left them in her room, hoping they would calm down. Only then did she hear screaming and the sounds of a struggle, after which she came running back and saw that the guy attacked her mom with a knife. However, Rachel's version did not coincide with the evidence that was found at the scene of the crime. The forensic report clearly established that Barbara's attacker was not alone. Specialists estimated that 5 minutes had been enough to kill the woman. Rachel continued to insist on her own innocence. Questions: why she didn't call emergency services, why she wrote a love text to the killer boyfriend, were frozen in the air unanswered. The forensic psychiatrist who worked with Miss Mullenix diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder. He believed she truly loved her mother, but she hated her equally as much. By the way, people with this kind of personality are prone to erratic behavior. It's often destructive to both the unsub and others. Bitter verdict. It took the jury 3 days to reach a final verdict. Ian Allen was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Rachel Mullenix, the court's verdict was no consolation either. She was found to be involved in the death of her mother and qualified the act as first-degree murder. The girl was sentenced to life in prison. Her first chance for parole will come when the inmate turns about 41 years old. After the verdict was announced, the prosecutor said she was relieved. There is no question that Ian Allen and Rachel Mullenix killed Barbara, Sonia Balest concluded. For a mother, such a death was a true betrayal. The day Barbara brought her daughter into the world, she signed her own death warrant. The child she loved immensely became her light and darkness at the same time. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Mullenix made many mistakes in her life. She was not an ideal mother, but she never abandoned her children to perdition. Barbara's jealousy and fear of being alone hardened the woman's already strong character. But people in love always have a choice. They could simply leave to preserve their right to their feelings. In time, things would have calmed down, relationships would have mended. Perhaps Barbara would have switched to something else, and the grandchildren Rachel and Ian would give her would be her outlet. Domestic violence, unfortunately, was not uncommon at all times, and often victims, for various reasons, prefer to silently tolerate this attitude to themselves, and the domestic tyrant, feeling his impunity, can overstep any boundaries. The worst thing in such situations is that children can become victims. A few years ago, the case of young Tylee Palmer shook the whole of Australia with its extraordinary cruelty and monstrous coincidence of circumstances, when a child from one dysfunctional family fell into another family, even more terrible and cruel. The girl's birth mother, trying to protect her only daughter from her tyrant husband, gave her to another family out of the best intentions, but as it turned out, she put Tylee in the hands of death itself. The case under consideration is quite complex and ambiguous. There were several criminals, and all of them were members of the same family. At the same time, the investigation came to the conclusion that almost all of them were victims of domestic tyranny themselves. And now I will tell about everything in order. A girl from a dysfunctional family. Tylee Alicia Rose Palmer was born in a small Australian town, Logan City, Queensland, in April 2003. Unfortunately, the conditions in which the girl grew up were far from ideal. The head of the family abused hot drinks, was a man hot-tempered and aggressive. He repeatedly beat his wife in front of the child and at times got to the daughter herself. The girl was constantly under stress, lived in an atmosphere of fear and oppression. It is not surprising that over time she began to regularly run away from home, so as not to hear the endless scandals of parents and not get under the hot hand of the father. About why the girl's mother, Cynthia Palmer, did not leave the man who abused her and her daughter, we can only guess. However, instead, the young woman chose to give her only child to another family, believing that this would be better. Subsequently, Cynthia repeatedly stated that it was a forced measure and that she was very sorry about it, but at that time to do otherwise could not, because she herself was hostage to circumstances. But there is another version, told by neighbors of the dysfunctional family. According to some reports, Cynthia herself is addicted to alcohol. She tried treatment, but to overcome addiction was not so easy, and after another escape Tylee from home, when she was found wandering the streets on the other side of the city, the Palmer family seriously interested in child protection services. Representatives of the service visited the family home and offered help, and Cynthia did not refuse to have her daughter temporarily placed in a foster home. Given the environment in which the girl was brought up, it is not surprising that she grew up to be a difficult teenager with a difficult character. Therefore, finding her a foster family was not an easy task. She was constantly running away, loitering and begging on the streets, disobeying her guardians, doing everything in her own way. Tylee did not stay with her first two families for long. because her foster parents simply could not cope with her. She did not commit any serious offenses, but she was periodically accused of lying. The girl wanted the comfort of home, but did not imagine what it should be. And any disagreement with the household inevitably ended with the escape of the child, the Thorburn family. In early 2015, it seemed that the perfect foster family had been found for Tylee and was ready to welcome her with open arms. The Thorburn family consisted of 4 people. Spouses Rick and Julia Thorburn were raising 2 sons, Josh, who was already 19 years old at the time, and Trent, who was barely 18. The family lived in a spacious 2-story house with a swimming pool located in a small country place in the suburbs of Brisbane. They owned their own horse farm, and Julia organized a private kindergarten at home, which was very popular, and local parents willingly trusted the Thorburns with their children. The family was considered well-to-do and prosperous, well-regarded in their home state, and trustworthy. In addition, they had indicated a willingness to take a troubled teenager into their care, which was rare. Child Protective Services decided that this option was the most suitable for Tylee, and in January, the girl moved into a new home. At first, everything went according to the usual scenario. The girl rebelled, refused to live with her guardians, and ran away from them several times, but each time the Child Welfare Service found her and sent her back. But as the months went by, Tylee seemed to calm down, accepted her new family, and got along with them. In reality, however, the outward well-being hid a real drama that soon spiraled into tragedy: the mysterious disappearance of Tylee. The girl studied in one of the local schools, which was located a few kilometers from the house of her guardians, so the foster father took Tylee to school every day and after school picked her up. She made a lot of friends in the new place, who spoke of her as a kind, cheerful girl, but she still dreamed of returning to her home and kept in touch with her biological mother and grandmother. Tylee also occasionally complained of discomfort and even fear, without specifying what exactly she was afraid of. On the morning of October 30th, 2015, Rick drove his car to school as usual and then returned home to do chores. But soon he received a phone call informing him that his adopted daughter had failed to show up for class. No one was particularly worried because the girl had run away many times before, but usually she returned in the evening or the next day. The guardians reported the incident to the police, and almost immediately the search for missing Tylee began. All members of the family willingly cooperated with the investigation and claimed that no conflicts that could provoke a runaway between them and Tylee for a long time has not been. On the contrary, the girl was in good spirits and looked quite happy. According to the head of the family, he took his daughter to school, as he usually did, and then drove back home and tended to the horses until he received a call from a teacher and reported the disappearance of the girl. His spouse and sons confirmed these words. The next day, the Thorburns created a social media page dedicated to the search for Tylee. There they posted information about her, her photos, the time and circumstances of her disappearance, as well as a description of the clothes she was wearing that day. The couple asked anyone who knew anything about Tylee's whereabouts to report it to them or to the police, but no one ever called. Police also searched the family's home and estate, but found nothing suspicious there. Although the behavior of the foster parents seemed too calm, they had essentially nothing to charge them. Soon, the search operation was joined by many concerned people, sincerely concerned about the fate of the girl. They combed the area, pasted flyers with her photos, and interviewed local residents, hoping to get at least some useful information. A discovery on the riverbank. After a week of unsuccessful searches, 2 fishermen turned to the police, reporting a terrible find. According to the men, on the morning of November 5th, they went to the Pimpama River, but after barely casting their fishing rods, they noticed something strange in the swampy, shallow water. As they got closer, the fishermen were horrified as they realized that their find was nothing but human remains. The police officers who arrived on the call noted that it was the body of a short man, but it was so disfigured that it was impossible even to identify the sex of the deceased. There were no clothes on him, and no personal belongings could be found nearby. The body had numerous injuries that were initially thought to have been left by wild animals in the area. In addition, it was badly decomposed due to heat, moisture, and numerous insects, which were attracted by the characteristic odor. The gruesome find was sent for examination, where it was determined that it was a girl whose approximate age was between 12 and 16 years old. Then the police collected information about all missing young people recently, and soon the corpse was identified. It was Tylee Palmer, which for almost a week the whole city was looking for. The cause of death was impossible to determine because the body had been in the water for a long time, but experts speculated that Tylee died of asphyxiation after discovering that her hyoid bone had been crushed. The most horrifying thing, however, was that the injuries, which were initially suspected to be animal bites, could have been inflicted by a person even before Tylee's death. It was immediately clear that Tylee's death was criminal in nature, so a criminal case was opened and a murder investigation was launched. But the investigation was moving very slowly because no serious leads could not be found yet, which meant that the process could take months or even years, or turn into another unsolved crime. The case quickly gained publicity, so to say goodbye to the dead girl came almost a quarter of the city's population. People carried flowers, soft toys, and balloons to the place where the memorial service was held. On November 14th, the body of young Tylee was cremated. Tylee's birth mother gave a series of interviews to reporters in which she openly accused Child Protective Services of criminal negligence that led to the tragedy. The strange Thorburns, the foster family, willingly cooperated with the investigation from the beginning, but their behavior raised certain suspicions. The last person to see the girl alive was supposedly Rick, but no one could confirm that he actually brought his foster daughter to school on the morning of October 30th. His spouse and sons claimed to have seen Tylee get into the car. Surveillance cameras along the route to the school also showed the car traveling in that direction, but no footage of Tylee leaving her guardian's car could be found anywhere. None of the teachers or classmates saw the girl that day, either at school or on school grounds. Tylee seemed to have vanished, although investigators had growing doubts that Palmer was even in the car. Family members occasionally confused their testimony about the events of that day, but insisted that everything was as it always was and there was nothing to portend trouble. Unchildren's secrets. As part of the investigation, dozens of children and teenagers were interviewed, with whom the deceased went to the same school and was friends. All spoke positively about her, but noted that recently Tylee had been worried about something, but she could not or was afraid to talk about it. A few days before the tragedy, Tylee asked a classmate to shelter her for a while. She said she was in trouble and the guardians would kill her. These words were not taken seriously, and the friend, though she felt sorry for her, could not bring someone to her house for a sleepover without parental consent. The other girl mentioned that Palmer had told her her secret. She was in love with the youngest of the Thorburn brothers, 18-year-old Trent. Moreover, she even bragged that they were romantically involved and would be together in the future. The latter revelation sounded rather strange because Tylee was only 12 years old, and a relationship with an older brother, even an adopted one, seemed something unlikely, like a childish fantasy. Nevertheless, the information she received was definitely something she had to check out. The members of the Thorburn family categorically denied any suspicions. They called their dead adopted daughter a liar who wanted to draw attention to herself, and also suggested that the girl's school friends could have made up something themselves or fantasized. There was no solid evidence to suspect the guardians of committing a crime against Tylee, so they remained at large, continuing to do their usual business. Their private kindergarten continued to take children. The farm prospered, and they didn't have to deal with the pain of loss. For several months, the investigation was actually treading on the same ground. Local residents with previous convictions were questioned, and those previously suspected of crimes were checked. But the search yielded no results, and no new leads appeared. Even the announced high reward for any information about the case did not move the process forward. A parallel search was conducted in the area where Tylee's body was found, and a month later, under a layer of silt, were found a backpack and a shoe, which presumably could belong to the deceased. They were found 150 meters away from where the body was. These things were obviously wanted to get rid of so that they would never be found. The whole story gained a wide public resonance. The results of the search and investigation were broadcast on television, published in the press, and the residents of the city organized pickets demanding to find and punish the killer or killers. Some pickets were organized by the biological mother of the deceased Tylee. Eventually, it came to the point where the police appealed to possible accomplices of the perpetrator, promising them protection and immunity if they named the perpetrator or provided any substantial information. But this appeal also went unanswered. In 6 months, no new clues or avenues of inquiry have emerged. An anonymous call and a wiretap at the Thorburn house. It wasn't until closer to the summer of 2016 that police received an anonymous call that changed the course of the investigation. The anonymous caller said that the Thorburns were looking for a troubled teenager for a reason. They were driven by a mercantile interest because the custody of troubled children are paid an increased allowance. Anonymous also added that their youngest son, most likely, had an intimate relationship with Tylee, which he himself mentioned in passing before the tragedy. Of course, this information could have been a lie, but detectives remembered that they had already heard the theory that Tylee and her named brother might have had an affair, from a high school friend of the deceased. The investigators decided not just to take a closer look at Trent, but to take a hard look at him. The interrogations yielded nothing, because the guy and his family members continued to insist on their non-involvement, claiming that the girl herself ran away and then got into trouble. The family's social media pages were quietly checked, and one of the chat rooms in Trent's profile revealed a curious correspondence. About a month and a half before the tragedy, he wrote to his cousin that he had intimacy with a girl much younger than him, but her name he did not give. Of course, the dialogue on the social network could not become incontrovertible evidence, but it allowed the police to obtain permission to install listening devices in the Thorburn house, of course, without their knowledge. Already in the first few days, the wiretaps yielded shocking results. On the recordings, the family members could be heard working out their version of events in detail, so that their stories coincided in the smallest detail. The head of the family taught his household what to say and how to behave, and from the mouth of the mother sounded such phrases as, "Dad made this decision to save us. We'll have to live with it. Never tell anyone or anything, no matter what happens." Several times Rick threatened his family members, and it was obvious that they were afraid of him because they knew that his father could go from words to action at any moment. There was still not enough direct evidence, but the Thorburns' blue card, which gave them permission to work with children, was almost immediately canceled, so the private kindergarten had to be closed. The wiretaps soon provided confirmation that the youngest of the brothers had indeed been intimate with Tylee. In fact, it happened regularly for several months, and in October he told his mother that Tylee was showing signs of pregnancy. If this hunch had been confirmed, Trent would have gone straight to jail for having an affair with young Tylee. That's when Julia told her husband everything, and Rick decided to take matters into his own hands. On the day of the tragedy, Julia and her sons went to Brisbane early in the morning, ostensibly on business. It was supposed to serve as an alibi for them, and Rick stayed home with his adopted daughter. When the mother and heirs returned home in the evening, it was already known that the girl was missing, and the head of the family said that he had solved the problem without specifying details. Arrest and investigation. Based on the records obtained, all members of the family decided to re-interview, and the police also decided to search Rick's car, in which he allegedly drove his adopted daughter to school on the day of her disappearance. And then it turned out that the car was sold almost immediately after the tragedy. The vehicle was tracked down, and a detailed inspection of it revealed old washed-out traces of blood in the trunk. DNA analysis revealed that the blood belonged to the murdered Tylee. After that, the last doubts were dispelled, and the Thorburns were taken into custody. They were questioned separately, and Trent was the first to speak. It turned out that he had tricked Tylee into seducing him, telling her about his feelings, promising that they would always be together, and Tylee, in love with him, believed it, and even bragged to her friends at school that she was in a real relationship. But when she got suspicious about the pregnancy, she realized that the foster father could kill her, literally, and began to ask her classmates to take her in, at least for a while. Rick fought back the longest, but under pressure from evidence and testimony from his family members, he confessed to killing his foster daughter, saying he was just trying to protect his family. He had indeed strangled Tylee and afterward disfigured her body, hoping no one would ever identify him. The possibility of DNA testing, Rick somehow didn't think about. When the head of the family was formally charged with first-degree murder, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital with a heart attack. There, doctors concluded that he had provoked the attack himself by taking a large dose of powerful drugs. They fought for his life for several days so that the perpetrator could stand trial and receive a fair punishment. The trial and sentencing of each of the family members. The investigation and trial was followed by the whole country, because the Tylee Palmer case became one of the loudest and cruelest in the last 10 years. Each member of the Thorburn family was found guilty, but their sentences were considered by many to be too lenient. For example, the eldest son, Josh, was sentenced to only 3 months in prison for perjury and attempting to obfuscate the investigation. The court took into account his sincere remorse and the fact that he was a key witness against his father and younger brother at the trial. Julia Thorburn received 1.5 years in prison for perjury and harboring her husband and son. At trial, she admitted that she was very afraid of her spouse and believed that he could also massacre her and her sons. The youngest of the brothers was sentenced to 4 years in prison, which many considered too lenient a punishment for seducing Tylee, perjury, and obstructing the investigation. In fact, the young man served only a little more than 1 year, after which he was released early. The head of the family, who dealt with Tylee in the most brutal way, was sentenced to life imprisonment. He himself pleaded guilty to all counts, noting that he was very sorry for what he had done. Rick kept repeating that he was driven by the desire to protect his family, but he himself does not understand how he could go to such a crime. After the final verdict, Tylee's birth mother gave an interview in which she said that none of the punishments for her daughter's killers she would have considered harsh enough, but the day of the verdict marked the end of her fight for justice. Monday, September 14, 2015, was remembered by 16-year-old Nolan Buchanan as the best day of his life. The day before, he had spent Sunday with his girlfriend. A traditional morning mass with his girlfriend's family, followed by a get-together with friends and a wonderfully romantic evening. Waking up on Monday morning, next to his favorite girl, the teenager felt like a free, successful, and influential businessman before whom the whole world is open. After all, he was now the owner of Buchanan Construction. The young man was going to inherit cars, a house, land, monetary assets, and made plans how he would manage the family business alone, and certainly do it better than his father, who brought the company to bankruptcy. It would seem that what could go wrong? Already on October 1st, 2015, Nolan Keith Buchanan was arrested at Bonita High School in Bonita, California, by the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. Nolan was incarcerated at the Juvenile Treatment Center, JTC, in South Lake Tahoe until June 13, 2018, when an El Dorado County jury of 7 men and 5 women found Buchanan guilty of 3 charges. The jury took just 2 hours to reach a verdict. The young man was sentenced to 150 years in prison with the possibility of parole from the 25th year of his sentence. This is how his plan to take over the family business ended. Neighbors and classmates spoke of Nolan as a model kid and a good student. As far as I know, he was a good kid, Anita High School student Campbell Ruxton would later say in an interview. He always cared about school, he seemed very kind, he was very nice. I'm even surprised he was arrested. But what really happened in the Buchanan family? Let's break down this horrific case in detail. Molly first met Adam Buchanan when she came to apply for a job at his firm as an office manager. By the time they met, Adam was already divorced and raising his son Nolan from a previous marriage on his own. Cheerful, sociable, and cheerful blonde immediately attracted the attention of the owner of the company. The interest was mutual. Molly fell in love, started a romance that turned into a serious relationship, and her move to Adam. Molly dreamed of a real, loving, friendly family and tried to build a wonderful relationship with her stepson. Soon she became pregnant. Gavin was born. People who knew the Buchanans claimed that they were a fairly close-knit family of 4. The head of the family, who owned a construction company, earned enough to ensure a comfortable life, and the family even purchased vacation property in El Dorado County, California. A small cabin sat on 19 acres in Greenwood, a rustic cabin with no electricity, water, sewer, or gas. Adam, who worked in construction, took an active role in remodeling the house, and the family began to visit there often. On September 13, 2015 at 10 a.m., members of the Garden Valley Fire Department responded to a wildfire in Greenwood Township in western El Dorado County on Highway 193 between Cool and Georgetown. Upon arrival, they found the fire had destroyed 10 acres of the property. A cabin located on the property was still smoldering, but had burned to the ground. The fire department personnel observed charred remains in the ashes. The scene of the fire was not touched, and at 11 a.m. firefighters called the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. No one had yet realized what was at the scene. Firefighters were almost certain that the victim of the wildfire was a pet trapped in the house. The arriving coroner was faced with a daunting task. The remains of the house were still smoldering, and there was no way to examine the inside of the house. They had to wait for the flames to finally die down and for the temperature to drop slightly. As the coroner examined the house, he smelled the sweet odor of burnt flesh and later discovered a human skull and a burned chest. It appeared that the tragedy had claimed someone's life. The officer requested backup. Officers from the sheriff's office arrived and conducted a thorough examination of the scene. The conclusion was obvious. The small, secluded and remote cabin was not the primary residence of its owners. Rather, it was most likely a country cabin where people came to vacation. A Dodge truck and trailer were found on the property adjacent to the cabin. It was possible to run the license plates and find out who the car belonged to. The owner may have been the victim of the wildfire. It didn't take long to find out that the vehicle and trailer belonged to Buchanan Construction, a company owned by a man named Adam Buchanan. The man in question lived 160 miles from the scene of the accident, about 3 hours away in Bonita, California. This information confirmed the assumption of the police, who decided that the house was just a country residence for those who vacation here from the hustle and bustle of the city. It remained to be seen who was inside, Mr. Buchanan himself or someone else. The name of the owner of the company gave the detectives their first clue, with which they began their investigation. The Bonita police officers were tasked with checking to see if all of Buchanan's family members were well and at home. They went to the correct address and were soon in the Buchanan's driveway, where they noticed a white Ford pickup truck. At a knock on the door, Adam's 16-year-old son from his first marriage came out. He greeted the uniformed officers with surprise and asked what brought them to him. The officers decided to first find out who was in the house so as not to frighten the household. Perhaps the company car had been taken by someone from the company and not the owner himself. Nolan Buchanan said his father Adam had gone away for the weekend to his country estate, 160 miles away, with Molly and their 8-year-old son Gavin, and they were due back in the evening. According to him, his father had left him to look after the house. Investigators did not yet have sufficient reason to believe the remains in the cabin were those of the Buchanans, but the information received and the discovery of the remains, believed to be those of 2 people, by the evening of September 13th, was enough to report the family missing in the El Dorado County fire. The next day, September 14th, El Dorado County Police went to Nolan's home to talk to him more thoroughly and try to figure out whose lives the fire had claimed. Officers were met by Adam's parents, Howard and Susan Buchanan. They said that their son, the owner of the burned-out cabin, does his own home repairs and therefore travels there very often. The parents were very concerned as they had not been able to contact their son or daughter-in-law until now. From the story, the officers learned that the house is connected to generators, but at the time of the tragedy, it had no electricity. There were, however, gas cylinders inside. This gave 2 theories. The fire could have been either accidental or intentional. By September 15th, the fire scene had cooled down and investigators were finally able to collect evidence, including debris from a nearby fire pit. According to Detective James Peterson of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, new remains were discovered that changed the direction of the case. Police found a piece of skull with a bullet hole. At that point, we all realized that there was actually a homicide. This was not an accidental fire. reported the sheriff. The remains were collected and sent for forensic DNA testing. In the first set of remains, the bullet was lodged in the victim's thigh. The skull with the bullet hole, judging by its size, belonged to a child. The version of fatal accident dropped by itself. The version of murder came to the forefront. No one now doubted that the fire was a means of destroying the traces of the crime. It remained to find out under what circumstances the crime had taken place. Was it a burglary that had gone wrong? Or had the family taken their lives deliberately? But then by whom and why? Or could the crime be related to Buchanan Construction, a company where Adam Buchanan was president and chief operating officer, and someone harbored a grudge against him due to a working relationship? Initially, investigators focused specifically on the latter theory. They also looked into Molly's life to determine if she had any enemies capable of the crime. Once those lines of inquiry stalled, officers turned their attention to problems in Molly and Adam's marriage. There proved to be plenty of them. Investigators learned that over time, Molly and Adam's relationship began to deteriorate, and at the time of the crime, they had been sleeping apart for quite some time. A diary was found in which Molly described abuse from Adam. Witnesses interviewed described rough treatment and abuse. According to them, Adam was rude not only to Molly, but also to the children. Molly's mother, Susie Slankard, admitted to investigators, "There were times when I was afraid they would kill each other in one of their arguments." Molly did not sever her relationship with Adam, but would periodically take her son and leave to go to her parents' house and return a few days later until the next fight. It also turned out that the couple liked to hunt in the area where their country house was located. Since everyone was armed, the investigators assumed that during another quarrel, one of the spouses grabbed a gun and shot, and when he realized what he had done, he took his own life. However, there was an inconsistency. If the tragedy happened because of a conflict between husband and wife, it means that near the remains of one of them must necessarily be the instrument of crime, which, however, was not. Investigators speculated that the weapon may have been damaged in the fire and may not have looked as obvious as expected. Over the course of 5 days, forensic team members took turns removing ashes from the home. The search was conducted with surgical thoroughness, but did not yield the expected result. No weapons were found in the house. By this time came the data of forensic examination. The examination confirmed that the DNA of the bodies belonged to Adam Buchanan, Molly McAfee, and their 8-year-old son. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds before the fire, and the angle of the bullet wounds ruled out the version that someone took their own life. The lack of firearms meant that someone else was in the house. A 4th person who shot the Buchanans, and the investigation had to start over. Police had no choice but to turn to the 16-year-old son of the deceased. Nolan told officers that the family drove away in an old Dodge truck. According to the son, his father decided to use the company vehicle rather than his personal Ford, which was parked in the driveway, because he had loaded the truck and trailer with rocks that he was going to decorate the area near his country cabin. It was this truck that police found near the burned structure. When asked why Nolan did not go on vacation with his relatives, the young man, as in the first interview, said that he had a duty to look after the house and garden during the absence of his father and stepmother. Nolan also said that they had a neighbor growing forbidden grass on the edge of the Buchanan property, which caused his father to have frequent arguments with this neighbor, demanding that he stop planting the grass and threatening to go to the police. Talking about the family business, Nolan told of the company's financial difficulties. Things were not going well. The company was undergoing downsizing and the number of employees was down to 5. From what his father said, the debts associated with the business were increasing rapidly. So now the investigation had a lot of useful information, and the detectives had a suspect, a neighbor, especially since in that area, violent crime was often linked to the cultivation of illegal herbs. Detectives felt that the threat of going to the police could have led to the murder of Buchanan and his family. The problem was, no one had any idea which neighbor they were talking about. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing all the homeowners in a row. The tactic was successful. They found a man who confirmed the story of a quarrel with Adam over growing a forbidden crop. But according to him, after a sharp conversation, the conflict was over. The neighbor had an alibi, and another version turned out to be untenable. What remained to be dealt with was the financial crisis that had hit the family's business. On September 18th, the police visited Adam's company and interviewed the employees. Nolan's words were true. The company was in a sorry state. It was threatened with bankruptcy, as the amount of debts exceeded $30,000. Because of this, some employees were fired. It turned out that some of the former employees were extremely dissatisfied with the reduction and therefore could be involved in the crime. And that's where investigators got lucky. Over the weekend, the local high school organized a community cleanup day. The students were clearing debris from a business park just a mile from Adam's construction company. It was there on September 19th that a small purse with a wallet and identification cards belonging to Molly Naitafi and Adam Buchanan was found under one of the bushes. A .22 caliber rifle was lying nearby. Detectives immediately went to the scene of the discovery. The county sheriff's office made a new assumption. The perpetrator had massacred the Buchanan family with the found rifle and, covering his tracks, had taken their documents from the crime scene. The discovery was important because it meant that someone had traveled all the way to Greenwood to kill the family and then returned to Bonita to dispose of the bag and murder weapon. It appeared to be a Bonita resident. A proximity of the evidence found to the location of Buchanan construction strengthened the theory that the boss was massacred by one of the disgruntled employees. Detectives sent the firearm and the bag of documents for examination, requesting a warrant to inspect the company's records and premises. Here, the investigators got lucky a second time. During the search, they gained access to a video surveillance camera installed on the firm's premises. By happy coincidence, the lens of the camera was directed not at the company's territory, but at the center of the parking lot. After this discovery, the case was just days away from being solved. Since it was already known that the family had gone out of town on Friday, investigators reviewed Friday's footage and were surprised to find that Adam had attached a trailer filled with rocks to a Ford F-150, not a Dodge truck as Nolan had told them. Detectives realized that the young man had deliberately manipulated the investigation. If the white Ford had towed the rock trailer to the cabin, then someone must have driven it back and parked it in the driveway of the Buchanan family home. Investigators re-interviewed Nolan, trying to keep him safe while getting as many details as possible. Nolan again recounted his weekend, where he had been, and who he had seen. Only this time they asked him what movie they had seen at the cinema, how he had paid for the shopping at the mall, and how he had paid for dessert on a date. The unsuspecting Nolan answered, with his father's credit card. The officers then applied for a warrant to search Buchanan's home in Bonita, search the vehicles, and check financial records. The Ford automobile was still parked in the driveway. It was closely inspected, and they noticed reddish soil sticking to the wheels, similar to that in Greenwood. If the Ford had been used for a trip last weekend or earlier, traces of soil might have remained, but they would not have been as obvious. Unfortunately, the fire had destroyed the wheel tread marks near the country house, but the dirt buildup indicated that the car had probably been to Greenwood recently. Detectives tracked the bank card payments and found that Adam Buchanan had used his credit card on Friday, September 11th, at fast food chain Taco Bell on his way to Greenwood. Nolan, on the other hand, claimed he stayed home, did not go with his parents, and had the credit card in his possession. Detectives went to the diner and checked the security cameras. They saw exactly what they expected, a white Ford instead of a truck. When detectives searched the Ford, they found a Taco Bell receipt dated September 11th that included not 3 but 4 drinks. Evidence collected at the scene of the fire similarly pointed to 4 drink cups. So Nolan was in the car? The next credit card transaction took place on Saturday, September 12th, at the Valencia Club bar in Penryn, about 30 minutes away from the cabin. Adam's parents had previously told detectives about the bar. They said their son and daughter-in-law liked to drop in there after renovations to the cabin. Security cameras recorded the time the couple left the bar, and traffic cameras on the highway helped track the couple's route. A Ford F-150 headed toward the Buchanan cabin around 2:30 a.m. on the day of the fire, and at 3:30 a.m. drove in the opposite direction. In the first instance, the camera captured Adam and Molly in the vehicle, and in the second, only Nolan. A few hours later, on Sunday morning, September 13th, Adam's credit card was used to pay at 3 of Benita's establishments: Starbucks, McDonald's, and a gas station. The bank confirmed to investigators that Buchanan had only one bank card. The facts contradicted Nolan's stories. By this time, forensic results had come back. Nolan's fingerprints were found on the gun. He was arrested right in the middle of a high school class. Nolan Buchanan pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. He attempted to distort the story and claimed that it was his father who shot the family, after which he pointed a rifle at him, and he, defending himself, took the weapon away, accidentally shooting his father. Nolan insisted it was self-defense, attributing the fire and subsequent lie to a state of panic and extreme fright. That's why he took gasoline and set the house on fire to make it look like nothing had happened there. The defense continually focused the jury's attention on Adam's abuse of his own son and other family members. The medical examiner questioned the verdict because the bullet wound mark on a piece of Gavin's skull was consistent with a shot fired at nearly a 90-degree angle. Nolan, on the other hand, claimed that his and his brother's beds were next to each other, and they were simultaneously awakened by the noise and screaming. It was at the moment of awakening that Nolan allegedly saw someone enter the bedroom and shoot Gavin. The shooter then pointed the rifle at him, and Nolan miraculously managed to push the attacker away. Under this scenario, the shot would have been fired at about a 45-degree angle, which was inconsistent with forensic evidence. The prosecution came to believe that Nolan shot his brother when they were alone in the house while their parents spent time at a bar. After waiting for his father and stepmother to return, Nolan shot them as well. Judging by where the bodies were found, Adam was killed first, followed by Molly. Nolan then took the rifle, his parents' papers, doused the bodies with gasoline, and set the house on fire. Then he went home, met his girlfriend, and spent the day with her, creating an alibi for himself. On July 13, 2018, a jury found Nolan guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. As a result, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Judge Kingsbury, in announcing the sentence, reflected on the verbal and physical abuse Nolan faced, on the testimony that Nolan massacred his brother because he didn't want him to go through the same horror, or be forced to live with what his father had already managed to do to him. But as she did, she also listed facts about the premeditation of the crime and subsequent arson, the creation of alibis, and the plans to run the family business that Nolan had voiced to family members. The judge cited a failure to follow rules and deviant behavior noted by staff at the South Lake Tahoe Juvenile Treatment Center, where Nolan went after his arrest. "Everyone has the opportunity to change," Judge Kingsbury told Nolan. "I hope you will do everything in your power to do so. If you behave well, you will have a chance to get out on parole in 25 years under the Senate bill and Supreme Court rulings. It's up to you whether you take that chance or not." Nolan continues to insist he is innocent. If he ever gets out on parole, he will have to pay a huge compensation to the victims. The amount of the payout is unknown at this time. You have to admit that death can sometimes be around every corner, that no one can ever predict where this meeting will take place, in a warm home, or on a dark and deserted street, or maybe, which certainly seems unlikely to many of you, even during a family dinner. However, there are exceptions to every story. Canny Ong's story is just such a story. Is this really possible? You ask. How could a simple family dinner end in a brutal murder that will shock all Malaysians, and the local authorities will even review the current legislation? Let's take a look at this case. Full name of the heroine, Canny Ong Lake Yang. She was born in 1974 in the Malaysian city of Ipoh, in a large family. And even though the city is considered a rather remarkable place for tourists, but Canny herself dreamed of something else, a prestigious job, traveling, and what else could a young woman dream of? Of course, all this couldn't just fall from the sky. She had to strive for her dream, and she understood that. First, Canny graduated from high school with a gold medal, then went to university in Hawaii, where she even got a degree in economics. The beginning was made, and it was necessary to develop further, and she, being already independent, went to Los Angeles, where she got a job in an advertising agency. The City of Dreams gave the young girl self-realization as a specialist in her field. It was there in 2001 that Kenny met Brandon Ong, who, just like her father, was born in Singapore, but left there with his family to America as a child and was now rightfully considered an American. Young Kenny and Brandon got married pretty quickly and moved to the neighboring city of San Diego. But only 2 years into their life together, there was an accident. Kenny's father fell ill with liver cancer. Her father was going to have a serious surgery in Malaysia, and it was not quite clear whether he would survive after such an operation or not. So Kenny quickly packed her things, and on June 1st, leaving her husband in America, flew to her father. Fortunately, the operation was successful. The disease receded. The doctors assured that B-Jen, as Kenny's father was called, would live for a long time and would surely wait for grandchildren. Kenny exhaled with relief. Finally, it was safe to return to her beloved husband and her favorite job. She took a morning flight to Los Angeles, and in the evening, Kenny invited her extended family to a farewell dinner at their favorite restaurant called Monty's, where they had gone on holidays when Kenny still lived with her parents. During dinner, Kenny's mom suddenly didn't feel well, and her caring daughter offered to drive her home. In the parking lot, she looked for a parking ticket in her purse for a long time, and when she couldn't find it, she decided that she had simply forgotten it in the interior of the car. So Kenny asked her sisters to watch her mother and ran to the car. She was gone for a long time. Her mother even decided to go to the car herself, but Kenny's car was not there, and neither was her daughter's. Then one of the sisters started to call Kenny's phone, but it, even more alarmingly, turned out to be switched off. The family knew Kenny very well. She couldn't afford to just disappear, and even if something had happened, she was sure to call and warn her family. But what could have happened in a closed parking lot, literally 300 feet from her family? Kenny's father went to the security guards and asked them to show the security footage. At first, there was nothing strange. His daughter walking toward the car, checking her pockets, looking in her purse for her keys. But then they noticed that behind Kenny there was a stranger moving behind him, and like Kenny, he was slowing down and speeding up. Already from another camera, the guards together with the worried father watched Kenny's car leaving the parking lot. But behind the wheel was a man, most likely the one who followed her in the parking lot, but Kenny herself, strangely enough, was sitting in the passenger seat. It all looked like a kidnapping, and the family immediately called the police. It should be given credit. The Malaysian police began the search for the missing woman as soon as they received information on the stolen car, and in a couple of hours, one of the highway patrol noticed a car on the road, which matched the description. In order not to frighten the possible perpetrator, and at the time, they did not fully understand whether it was a kidnapping or not, the police patrol stopped the car to check the documents. The car stopped. The driver was visibly nervous, but still with a smile gave the policeman his license, and Kenny, who was sitting next to him, tried to give the policeman some signs, but he was checking the driver's documents. Unfortunately, he did not understand it, but the kidnapper paid attention to it, and he pressed the gas pedal to the floor and drove away from the patrol car. The police tried to shoot at the trail, but to no avail. The car fled, but they still had the documents of the kidnapper, 27-year-old Ahmad Najib bin Aris. Let me tell you a brief biography of this guy. Ahmad was born in 1976 and grew up in Mor, Malaysia. He was the second of 4 siblings in the family. Ahmad Najib studied until the 3rd year of secondary school before dropping out, not continuing the last 2 years of secondary education. Secondary education in Malaysia lasts 5 years because he had to work to feed his family and was a hard worker. In 1998, he came from Muar to Kuala Lumpur. Later, Ahmad Najib was married and had 2 children. According to people who knew him, Ahmad Najib was a man of good character and responsible in his work. And now back to our case. After a while, it turned out that the shooting at the car did not go without result. A young man approached the police and told a strange story. He said that during dinner at a roadside cafe, an unknown guy approached him and said that he was going on vacation with his wife, but on the road he punctured a tire and now they could not go further. The young man gladly decided to help the stranger. They went outside. He took a jack out of the trunk, gave it to the traveler, but he noticed bullet marks on the car, and on the front seat he saw a frightened woman, hardly looking like a wife going on a carefree vacation with her beloved husband. The so-called husband himself did not change the tire, but only fiddled with the jack for a while, grumbled, and gave it back. The police immediately realized that it was Kenny and her kidnapper was Ahmad. However, that was the last time Kenny was seen alive. Kenny Ong, or rather her body, would be found only 3 days later in a sewer manhole near a construction site, almost burned to the ground. As the autopsy will show, the woman was first stabbed in the stomach several times and later strangled. Also, not far from the construction site, will be found in Kemi's car, with a punctured or rather shot tire and with bloodstains on the back seat. The police, who had the killer's documents in their possession, for some reason decided to go to the address where Ahmad lived only after the body was found. The amazing thing about this story is that the killer was at home and living a very ordinary life, as if nothing had happened, as if he had not stolen someone else's car, as if he had not kidnapped a woman who had come to visit her father during his illness, and finally, as if he had not driven away from the police officers who were shooting at him. Later, after Ahmad's arrest, forensic tests would prove that in addition to Kenny's blood, Ahmad's own DNA was in the car. We would like to clarify that in Malaysia, murders, especially such brutal ones, are extremely rare. The point is that according to the criminal code, a murderer is entitled to the highest punishment, not even life imprisonment, but the death penalty. It is unclear what Ahmad hoped for, knowing that the police have all the data on him, but he confessed everything and even decided to help the investigation, counting on the fact that it will save him from death. Naturally, the brutal criminal put on the mask of an innocent sheep. At the trial, he said that that night in the parking lot, he was looking for a completely different woman, but mistaken, and realized it only when he was riding with Kenny in the car. According to him, they even laughed together about the situation, and later he tried to get her to have sex with him, and again, according to him, Kenny was not even against it, and the strangulation marks on her neck were just part of the woman's sexual fantasy, which is why she died. A terrified Ahmad decided to dispose of the body and set Kenny on fire. This story was made up from start to finish by Ahmad's lawyers, because in such a case he would have been awarded only abuse of the deceased, or at worst negligent homicide, given that Kenny had asked to be strangled herself during the intimate encounter. And supposedly, if this is not true, if all this is just a fantasy of the defendant, then why the captive did not run away while her captor was changing the tire, the lawyers said. Such a version could sound even convincing, if it were not for the stab wounds in the abdomen. It was at this point that the whole defense fell apart like a house of cards. It was obvious, because the investigation had a different, more reliable, autopsy-confirmed view of what had happened. Ahmad saw a lone woman in the parking lot outside Monty's restaurant and followed her. When Kenny opened her car, he threatened her with a knife, ordered her into the passenger seat, and got behind the wheel himself. After that encounter with police officers and a failed attempt to replace a blown tire, he drove the car to a deserted location, put a terrified Kenny in the back seat, and used her several times. Kenny tried to resist, for which she was stabbed several times in the stomach and later strangled with a coat belt. After the abuse, Ahmad took her already dead body outside and threw it into the first manhole, covering it with tires so that it would not be found. He returned to this manhole the next day with several canisters of gasoline and decided to finally hide the traces of the crime, filled Kenny's body with gasoline, and set it on fire. In addition, as it turned out later, Ahmad had 4 rapes against women who fortunately did not die, but still fearing conviction, did not file a police report. Finally, on February 23, 2005, the court, for some reason lasting for several years, finally sentenced the murderer and, among other things, gave Ahmad 10 lashes. But did this make it any easier for the parents who had lost their daughter forever? Being behind bars Ahmad tried to appeal his sentence and even wrote a letter to Selangor, the head of state, asking him to pardon him, but of course he was refused. And only 13 years after Kenny's murder, Ahmad got what he deserved. On September 23, 2016, he was hanged right in his cell. As I said, this case was quite high profile in Malaysia. Residents were frightened not so much by the brutality of the murder itself, and Ahmad's seemingly empty belief in his impunity, but by the fact that it is not so difficult to kidnap a person in a crowded shopping center, albeit in a parking lot. To prevent this from happening again, the Malaysian authorities began to install as many CCTV cameras as possible around the country, increased the number of security guards in shopping centers, and even made parking spaces specifically for women. And in all this situation, it is very pathetic that for such measures it was necessary to sacrifice the life of an innocent woman who flew to her father for 2 weeks from tens of thousands of miles away. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, it was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, Soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court, although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims. He, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, Many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis. In 2003, this high-profile story shook the whole of Brazil and was widely covered by the international media. Hundreds of law enforcers, rescuers, and volunteers from among those who cared about the story were searching for the young couple who disappeared in the forests of Embu-Guaçu province. They had hoped to find them alive, but unfortunately those hopes were not realized, and the last days of the young people turned into a real nightmare. But grief-stricken members of the families of the missing ahead awaited another ordeal when the main criminal, rapist, torturer, and brutal killer was not punished, moreover, found himself in better conditions than he lived before. Who are Liana Friedenbach and Felipe Café? Liana Bay Friedenbach was born in Sao Paulo in May 1987. The girl was the eldest of 2 children and her parents. She grew up in a fairly well-known and wealthy family. The head of the family, Henry Friedenbach, was a successful lawyer and a very respected man in the city. Felipe Silva Café was also a native of Sao Paulo, where he was born in July 1984. But he was brought up in a rather modest, large family. From childhood used to work part-time, tried to provide for himself independently, and help his relatives. Young people met as school children. Between them, there was a friendship, which grew into mutual sympathy in the first youthful love, but they had to hide it in every possible way. It is worth noting that Liana's parents were religious people. They brought up their daughter in strictness. She attended Sunday school from an early age and regularly went to church. Father and mother were categorically against her romantic relationships at such a young age. In addition, social inequality also played a significant role in this matter, because the girl, as I have already said, was from a wealthy family, and her chosen one was poor. But the prohibitions of parents did not force the young people to part. They simply began to hide their affair, secretly arranging dates in different places where no one could see them, in order to spend at least a little time together. One last trip. In the fall of 2003, the lovers decided to get away from everyone for a while, taking a trip to a remote, deserted area to be alone for a while. They carefully prepared for the trip, which was to be an exciting adventure for them. And above all, the boys took care of a plausible alibi that would justify their absence and would not arouse suspicion. Felipe told his parents that he and his friends were going on a camping trip. Liana, on the other hand, could think of nothing better to say than that she was going on a sightseeing trip with the guys from church. She knew for sure that this excuse would work and her parents would let her go, no questions asked. The Friedenbach and Café families believed the stories made up by the teenagers and let their children go to their deaths without worrying about anything. Liana and Felipe were unspeakably happy. They could enjoy each other's company for a whole week without fear of inhibitions and censure from their parents. The young people decided to go to a picturesque province called Embu-Guaçu. They took with them a tent, sleeping bags, some personal belongings, and a small stock of provisions. But the couple had practically no money, and this caused some difficulties. Being students, they had the right to free public transportation, so the guys thought out and calculated their route in advance to get to their destination by bus. Early in the morning of October 31st, the lovers met at the agreed place, taking care that no one who knew them could see them together. They took the first bus, and after reaching another city in the late evening, they spent the night right in the bus station. Then 2 more transports took them to their desired location. From there, they had to walk a few kilometers to a deserted place hidden in the woods, where they planned to camp and spend a few days alone with each other. The day was warm and sunny, and the young people, in spite of their fatigue after the long journey, were in good spirits, joking, laughing, and making plans for their little vacation. When they reached the place marked on the map, they began to set up their modest but cozy camp. Uninvited guests. When Liana and Felipe traveled to such a remote and secluded place, they did not take into account the fact that in those areas reigns poverty, against which crime thrives, so the appearance of well-dressed young men with large backpacks and bags did not go unnoticed. As the couple walked through the forest to the abandoned farm where they planned to stay, they caught the eye of local bandits fishing near a pond. They were Paulo Cesar de Silva Marques, nicknamed Pernambuco, and Roberto Alves Cardoso, known as Chiampino. The latter was only 16 years old, but he was already the leader of the gang he organized. The criminals were interested in strangers, especially they liked a beautiful young girl. In addition, they decided that in their backpacks there was something to gain, and they could rob them. The bandits stealthily followed the guys and began to watch, lurking in the thickets. The lovers set up a tent, had a snack, and then began to beautify the place of their parting lot. The intruders sat in ambush until they were sure that no one else would join the young men, and they had no weapons on them. Pernambuco and Chiampino then attacked Liana and Felipe, threatening them, and the latter, frightened, did not even try to run away or fight back against the unknown assailants. Having searched all the bags and backpacks, the criminals found nothing that could interest them. Then the bandits decided that they could demand ransom for the boy and the girl from their relatives. Liana, who was scared to death, immediately confirmed that she was from a rich family, and her father would give them as much money as they asked for. The criminals were happy about this turn, but since they had no experience in such cases, they did not know how to organize everything in order to stay with the money and free in the end. Prisoners. While the plan was maturing, and the bandits were trying to figure out who they had in their hands and how much they could ask for their lives, they decided to hide the prisoners so they couldn't escape. Initially, they were taken to a dilapidated structure near the very farm where the boys were staying, but there were no windows or doors. It was soon decided to bring the pair to the home of one of the gang members. There, Felipe was tied up and severely beaten so that he could not make an escape and offer no resistance. That same night, all the gang members took turns taking advantage of the bound and helpless girl, finally breaking her morally. The criminals could not figure out how to demand and collect the ransom, so they simply decided to get rid of the captives and hide their bodies somewhere in the woods so that they would never be found. After torturing the boys, the next day they were taken to a deserted place in the woods. The half-dead Felipe Pernambuco took them deep into the forest, from where a shot was heard, and then the bandit returned alone. Liana realized what had happened, and that her beloved was no longer alive, although the kidnappers tried to assure her that they had released the young man. They had other plans for the beautiful young Liana. The scoundrels wanted to keep her as a plaything until they got bored with her, especially since no one had started looking for the missing boys at that time. A couple of days after her daughter's departure, her parents found out that there was no excursion trip with the guys from the church, and Liana's friends don't know where she went. The Friedenbach family guessed that their heiress had run off with her boyfriend and immediately contacted his parents to find out where their children might be. But Cafe's family was sure their son had gone camping with his buddies, so there was nothing they could do to help locate the couple. The situation was complicated by the fact that neither of the young men had been in touch for several days, and their phones were turned off. Thanks to his connections and money, Henri put on their feet literally all the police in the city. Step by step, bit by bit, they managed to reconstruct the route the young people took after they had run away from home by trickery. The police soon reached Mbuguasu, where the boys got off their last bus, and further their way lay through a deserted wooded area. It was also there that their phones were last online. A large-scale search began, involving police officers, rescuers, and just concerned people who, having learned about the incident, decided to help. A large local businessman also joined the operation, providing his personal helicopter to search from the air and spreading leaflets with photos of the missing young people. Their camp was found quite quickly, and it looked frightening. Despite the lack of signs of blood and fighting, it was clear that something terrible had happened here. The couple's personal belongings had been turned out of their bags and carelessly scattered. The tent had been opened from top to bottom with a knife, and the guys' cell phones were lying around. Scouring every mile, rescuers soon discovered Felipe's breathless body. The tied-up guy had been shot in the back of the head almost at point-blank range, so he had no chance of being rescued. It became clear that the probability of finding Liana alive is minimal, but hope, as they say, dies last. Henri Friedenbach involved the press in the search, making sure that the whole process was widely covered in the media, and as many people as possible learned about it. For any information about Liana's whereabouts, an impressive reward was announced, but it did not help the case: the massacre of Liana. After the criminals got rid of Felipe, they brought Liana back to the house where they had previously held them both. By then, the bandits had been joined by their accomplices, Antonio Gaetano da Silva and Agnaldo Pires. Ciampino proudly announced to them that Liana was his property and could do whatever he wanted with her. He invited everyone to fulfill their dirtiest fantasies with Liana, and his offer was immediately accepted. A day later, after learning about the large-scale search operation, the criminals decided to change their location and moved with the victim to the house of Anthony Matias de Barros, another member of the gang. In the evening of the same day, they went fishing, taking Liana with them. The ringleader threw his jacket over her because it was chilly outside, and he decided to show concern in this way. In the evening, the older brother of Ciampino, whom the juvenile delinquent had not told about his affairs, came to the same place. Ciampino told his brother that Liana was his lover, but he immediately recognized her as the wanted girl. He took his brother aside and said that his captive was being actively sought, so that the police were literally following them. Ciampino took his brother's words as a sign and a call to action. He decided that it was urgent to get rid of Liana and then run away and lay low. He lied to Liana, saying that she was free and he would lead her to the road. In fact, the bandit led his victim into the forest, where he brutally killed her with a knife and then smashed her head with a rock to make sure she was dead. Liana's body was not found until 5 days after the massacre. There was literally no life on her. She was very badly mutilated. Liana was wearing the killer's jacket, which later became one of the key pieces of evidence. The criminals were incredibly cruel, cynical, and ruthless, but at the same time, as stupid and short-sighted. They did not try to run or hide, did not bother to destroy the physical evidence, and at the same time believed that no one would ever find them. This naive self-confidence of the bandits helped the police quickly identify them and apprehend all members of the criminal gang. Ciampino, as I have already said, left his jacket on the victim's body, which had his sweat marks on it. In addition, he brought the murder weapon to his house, washed it, and hid it in the yard, while he tried to wash the clothes with traces of the murdered girl's blood so that he could continue to wear them. According to the results of DNA analysis, it was possible to identify the gang members who had committed violence against Liana. All the gang members were apprehended almost simultaneously. The ringleader not only did not deny it, but immediately began to testify, boasting that it was he who had kidnapped, abused, and then killed the unfortunate victim. He described in detail everything that had happened to Liana in the last days of her life. Following a lengthy trial, almost all of the adult members of the criminal gang received fairly harsh sentences. Hernan Buca was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Felipe. Antonio Gaetano da Silva, as well as Agnaldo Pires, also received life sentences, but Anthony Matias de Barros was sentenced to only 6 years in prison because he himself did not torture the victim, but provided the gang with his house, where it all took place. However, with the ringleader and the most brutal member of the gang, everything was not so simple. At the time of his crimes, he himself was barely 16 years old. For this reason, the guy was sent to a specialized prison for minors with a fairly mild regime. Ciampino made several escape attempts, behaved aggressively and inadequately, because of which he was appointed a psychiatric examination. He was found to have several mental abnormalities, which in themselves were not something dangerous, but in the sum gave a monstrous result, turning the young man into a sophisticated sadist and murderer without feelings of pity or remorse. After such a diagnosis, the criminal was transferred to a closed-type medical institution, where he was to undergo compulsory treatment and rehabilitation. No further punishment was ever achieved for him, despite numerous appeals filed by the families of the murdered young men. As a result, Ciampino ended up in better conditions than he had been in before the crime. He now had his own private, cozy room with a large TV, internet access, and a comfortable bed with an orthopedic mattress. He has a balanced 4 meals a day with a customized menu, which is part of the policy of the medical facility where he is being held. His monthly maintenance is estimated at about $12,000. That's about $2,500. In recent years, the perpetrator has regularly petitioned for his release, noting that he has undergone a full course of treatment and no longer poses any threat to others, which means he can return to his normal life. This is a monstrous story,